Some things can be done in animation that simply cannot be replicated in live-action film, and one of them is the wild take, an over-the-top, manic or hysterical, anatomically impossible reaction to something unexpected. One of the 12 principles of animation is exaggeration of movement and facial expression, and the wild take represents perhaps the ultimate example of this principle, pushing the traditional take to unrealistic extremes. Today we're taking a look back at the evolution of the take in animation and how the wild take took off like wildfire after it was codified and perfected in the early 1940s before becoming a staple in animation by the end of the century. A take is a comedic, exaggerated, physical reaction to something unexpected. Essentially a delayed response, in which the reaction itself becomes the punchline of the gag. The take originated in 19th century stage comedy, particularly vaudeville, where performers used exaggerated reactions so that audiences in large theaters could easily read the joke visually. Over time, the take evolved into several familiar variations, including the double take, the spit take, and of course, the wild take, which is largely unique to animation. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the rubber hose style of animation gave characters an exaggerated flexibility not possible in live-action films. But these distortions were simply part of the normal movement of animation at this time, not a separate comedic reaction. Early prototypes of wild takes were performed by Mickey Mouse in a handful of Disney cartoons towards the end of the 1920s, animated by Ub Iwerks. Throughout the 1930s, animators at Fleischer Studios pushed facial expressions even further in their surreal and oftentimes nightmarish cartoons, while at Warner Brothers, director Tex Avery began experimenting with reaction gags of his own. In 1937, Tex Avery introduced the character Daffy Duck, whose manic personality often erupts into extreme outbursts and wild reactions, some of which were so over the top the reaction became a joke itself. In 1941, Tex Avery left Warner Brothers to join Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, where he began working in 1942 with his own animation unit, which included talented ex-Disney animators such as Preston Blair and Ed Love. At MGM, Avery's creativity reached its peak, and here the director pushed cartoon comedy to new extremes, creating films defined by their speed, absurdity, and a tendency to break the rules of animation itself. Avery's third cartoon at MGM was Dumbhounded, released in 1943, and which debuted the character Droopy, a bloodhound tasked with tracking down an escaped convict played by the Wolf, who spends the entire cartoon trying to escape, only for Droopy to appear wherever the Wolf goes. In contrast to Droopy's lethargic, deadpan demeanor, the Wolf's reactions to encountering Droopy laid the blueprint for manic, over-the-top reactions that would become a hallmark of Avery's cartoons during his time at MGM. The Wolf would appear in Avery's next cartoon, Red Hot Riding Hood, released 2 months later, in which he appears as a visual gag, as a wolf in 1940 slang meant a womanizer. And the cartoon featured an iconic scene in which the wolf reacts wildly to the onstage performance of nightclub singer Red. The nightclub scene was animated by Ed Love, who became known for taking such gags to extremes. And in Red Hot Riding Hood, the cartoon wild take is perfected and codified, setting the standard for decades to come. Avery's wild take magnum opus would come in the cartoon Northwest Hounded Police, essentially a remake of the cartoon Dumbhounded, released in 1946. Northwest Hounded Police followed the same storyline as Dumbhounded, featuring Droopy playing law enforcement tracking down an escaped convict, the Wolf, who reacts just as hysterically as before, only this time his frenzied reactions grow ever more wild every time he runs into Droopy, culminating in what gets my vote as possibly the greatest wild take ever seen in animation. Following Avery's innovations, the wild take took off like wildfire, as other animators followed suit, and the wild take quickly became a staple of cartoon comedy. At MGM itself, just down the hall from the Avery unit, directors William Hanna and Joseph Barbera started incorporating wild takes into their Tom and Jerry cartoons, including possibly the earliest example of a literal jaw drop, as seen in the Academy Award-winning cartoon Quiet Please. While over at Walter Lantz Productions, the Swing Symphony cartoon Abu Ben Boogie, released in 1944, featured familiar, over-the-top, lustful reactions to the performance of the lovely Miss X. Wild takes became commonplace in Warner Brothers cartoons, with directors like Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones having various characters regularly performing rapid-fire takes. And at famous studios, wild takes became a staple of Casper the Friendly Ghost cartoons, which featured characters reacting hysterically to realizing Casper is a ghost. Their reactions of fear possibly inspired by previous Avery cartoons like Slap Happy Lion. Interestingly, a ban was placed on cartoon wild takes during the television era, a period when TV executives started micromanaging animated series every step of the way, systematically stamping out silly eccentricities like wild takes. A CBS memo dated around 1978 explicitly forbids animated distortions of the wild take kind, stating, and I quote, "The networks will not accept any wild takes on characters. This means that any reaction where the body comes apart, becomes distorted, eyes pop out, and the chin drops to the floor, etc. will not be accepted. Please don't do it." As a result, wild takes became very scarce during this period and were toned down on the rare occasion they did appear. Filmation storyboard artist Eddie Fitzgerald reportedly got into trouble with his producers for featuring this wild take in the 1979 episode Movie Mouse from the Filmation series The New Adventures of Mighty Mouse and Heckle and Jekyll. Fitzgerald was told by executive producers Lowe Scheimer and Norm Prescott that the scene couldn't be animated, but animator Kent Butterworth insisted that it could, and spent a week working on it to prove it. Fitzgerald, Butterworth, and other staff members like Tom Minton and Ren and Stimpy creator John Kricfalusi would later go on to work on Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse and New Adventures, with Minton describing his work on that series as revenge for what they couldn't do at Filmation. It was Mighty Mouse and New Adventures, a zany and satirical animated series developed by Ralph Bakshi that helped bring wild takes back to the mainstream. Artists who worked on the show never saw a single note from CBS or Standards and Practices because Bakshi reportedly refused to pass them along. Having a filmmaker with Bakshi's stature around to push back against the network on their behalf gave the young staff of future animation legends free rein to try out subversively cartoony gags of the kind that had been banned from TV for years. Mighty Mouse paved the way for other animated series in the late 1980s to once again start using wild takes, which even became a running gag in the Scooby-Doo spin-off series, A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, in which veterans William Hanna and Joseph Barbera were happy to get a chance to use them again. Series developer Tom Ruger thanked the two for teaching him that they needed to use equally wild sound effects whenever they created Tex Avery-style wild takes. These series certainly had an influence on American animation, but the major comeback for classic cartoon slapstick was the groundbreaking hybrid feature Who Framed Roger Rabbit in 1988. Animation director Richard Williams took inspiration from cartoons of the 1940s as a guide for drawing Roger's crazed histrionics. By the turn of the decade, wild takes were considered a common trope, even a stereotype of cartoons. In the 1990 Tiny Toon Adventures episode Wild Takes Class, Bugs Bunny gives a lecture on the subject at Acme University, where he teaches the next generation of cartoon characters the art of the wild take.
As you know, a wild take is how we Toons express surprise, confusion, anger, and a whole bunch of other feelings. You call those takes?
In the 1992 episode of Garfield and Friends entitled The Cartoon Cat Conspiracy, Garfield deconstructs a typical cartoon and points out many problems he has with cartoons at that point, including the wild take.
The bus is running late.
A trope which was also lampooned later in an episode of I Am Weasel.
Original my tale. Wild takes are older than my grandmama.
You eat an egg?
Cartoon wild takes made a roaring comeback in the 1990s thanks to the Ren and Stimpy show, which wasted no time in showcasing their hilarious takes in the pilot episode Big House Blues. The Ren and Stimpy show offered particularly original spins on the traditional wild take, with one of the wildest of wild takes occurring in the episode In the Army, directed by Bob Camp. Like Roger Rabbit before him, the Mask character was a homage to American cartoons from the 1940s, particularly that of Tex Avery. And The Mask, the animated series, was especially fond of traditional wild takes, as was Animaniacs, a show which paid homage to the golden age of Warner Brothers cartoons, and which featured wild takes regularly. On the big screen, we were treated to wild takes in films such as Aladdin and Cool World, and the trope remained a staple of 90s cartoons, appearing seemingly everywhere, from Cow and Chicken to Freakazoid to Dexter's Laboratory, and even Disney series like Bonkers and Timon and Pumbaa. Possibly the last of the great cartoon wild takes could be found in Courage the Cowardly Dog, which featured Courage performing some kind of wild take in practically every episode. And over the years, SpongeBob SquarePants has made an effort to retain many classic cartoon tropes, including the wild take. Earlier, I put forward the final wild take scene in Northwest Hounded Police as possibly the greatest wild take ever seen in animation. But what about you? Let us know in the comments below which were some of your favorites over the years, and which of those wild takes you consider to be the wildest of them all. This video was an overview of the history of the cartoon wild take, not a comprehensive list of every wild take ever seen in animation, so please do comment down below and let us know what were some other wild takes not mentioned in today's video that you remember fondly. Please like this video if you learned something today. Remember to share this video with any of your friends and family who enjoy a good wild take, and feel free to suggest in the comments below if there are any other popular animated tropes that you would like me to explore the history of. I'll be back again soon, so until then, stay safe, stay wild, and stay tuned for more cartoon history.